Hello, everybody. Welcome to VOA's Issues and Opinions. Today is August 2nd. I'm Wang Nan. I'm Ye Fan. The armed conflict in Lebanon is still continuing, and the civilians are caught in the crossfire. The situation is really a big concern. Today, we'll be talking about the conflict in Lebanon. Also, in today's program, we'll be bringing to you the health of the Cuban communist ruler Castro and the new developments in North Korea. But let's go to Baoshen for the latest world news. Hello, you are tuning into VOA's Issues and Opinions. Today is August 2nd. Well, let's focus first on the situation in Lebanon. On Wednesday, Israelis are engaged in heated battle with Hezbollah in the Bekaa Valley. U.S. officials claim progress on establishing international peacekeeping force for Lebanon, but said that no quick ceasefire seemed likely in the 3-week conflict. Our reporter reports. The Israeli Prime Minister Peres met with a wide range of Washington officials on Tuesday, vowing to clear southern Lebanon of the Hezbollah militia and their weapons. In a speech, he said that Peres said he supports an international force if the European community, the United States, and the Quartet think that the international force can help, that will be okay. However, he noted that Israel will not allow Hezbollah to continue to assault Israel from southern Lebanon. Later, Peres said that he doesn't want to say, but it's a matter of weeks, maybe even less, before the conflict would finish. Secretary Rice says, "I still believe that if we really put our minds to it and work, that this week is entirely possible." At the same time, the British Prime Minister on Tuesday called for an alliance of moderation to counter the act of extremism stretching across the Middle East. He says, "We will continue to do all we can to halt the hostilities." Mr. Blair said that we must win the battle against this global extremism at the level of values as well as force. The conflict began after July the 2nd, when Hezbollah abducted 2 soldiers. For some 500 Lebanons have died in the conflict, and on the part of Israel, some 50 people died, most of them soldiers.
Today we'll be talking mostly about the conflict in Lebanon, but first let's go for a minute to Cuba. Fidel Castro said on Tuesday that he was in good spirits after surgery, according to a statement read on state television, and at the same time, with Fidel Castro ailing, the Bush administration said on Tuesday that the U.S. is prepared to support a democratic transition. On Tuesday, he said through the state media that his condition was stable and that he needs time to recover. He said, "I can't make up positive news because it would not be ethical. And if the news were to be bad, the enemy would be the only one who would benefit from it. In regards to the specific situation of Cuba, due to the plans of the empire, my health diagnosis becomes a state secret that cannot be broadcast in the news on a continuous basis. And our countrymen and women need to understand this. I cannot fail in a vicious cycle of health reports that are moved along the day. I can say that my situation is stable, but my health evolution needs time. I can say that my health would have to be stable for many days before I could give a final verdict on it. I am very thankful for the message I receive from all of our citizens and from all of our friends worldwide." At the same time, Castro's old comrade-in-arms, Maria Antonia Figueroa, talked about the situation. She said it was terrible that the Americans were gloating over it, especially the activities going on in Miami and Little Havana. She is 88 now, and she was involved from the very beginning in the activities with Castro and has been together with him all his life. At the same time as all of this, the White House said that Monday night, after learning the news, has been very much paying attention to the development of the situation. And Tony Snow, White House press secretary, said the one thing that this president has talked about from the very beginning is his hope for the Cuban people finally to enjoy the fruits of freedom and democracy, and for the dictator, Fidel Castro, to hand off power to his brother, who's been prison keeper. And that's not a change in status at all. So Raul Castro's attempt to impose himself on the people is much the same as what his brother did. So there are no plans to reach out. Since the early 60s, when Cuba joined the former Soviet Union camp, Cuba and the U.S. have been sworn enemies.
Well, you're tuning to VOA's Issues and Opinions. Next, we'll be talking about We'll be talking about the situation in the Middle East. I'm going to turn this over to Wang Nan. Thank you, Yefan. Israel is intensifying its attacks on the Hezbollah guerrillas in Lebanon. And the international community, of course, are working very hard to achieve a ceasefire, and no sign of which is in sight at this point. Today, we'll be talking about the situation in Lebanon, and we'd like to expose you to a wide range of views here in the States. Today, we have the honor of having an expert in our studio whose name is Mark Bruzonsky, and he's the founder and publisher of Middle East Realities. He's been working on the Middle East for many years, has paid 150 visits to the Middle East, and he has served as advisor on Middle East affairs for many organizations. Mr. Bruzonsky speaks English, which is simultaneously interpreted into Chinese. In the course of our discussion, you're encouraged to call in to participate in our discussion. Please dial 1-866-837-5161, 1-810-866-871-5161. That's our toll-free number. Mr. Bruzonsky, thank you for coming to our show.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
So if I'm wrong, then please go ahead and correct me. But I would like to have you tell us more. First of all, you yourself are a Jew, but you are not happy with Israel's and the U.S.'s policies. You're critical of them. Is that right?
Very much, and very many Americans are, very many Jews are, very many people around the world are. The situation that we're now witnessing didn't start a few weeks ago. It started in the 40s. The Israelis have planned this war for some time, and everybody in the Middle East knows that. The presentation on TV is somewhat different. Everybody makes excuses. Everybody has to play to public opinion. But what we're witnessing is a very dangerous moment in the history of the Middle East. The United States and Israel are attempting to create the New World Order. They don't use that word anymore. The president's father used that word when he was president and didn't do a very good job of creating the New World Order. I'm afraid his son, our current president, is doing a much worse job. It's not a New World Order at all. It's a New World disorder, getting more disorderly, more dangerous all the time. Israeli policies are frankly outrageous. They border on war crimes, and this is not my term from a journalist sitting in front of you. This word is being used all over the world. It's being used at the UN. It's been used by the highest ranking official at the UN in human rights, Louise Arbour. But it's not very often heard in Washington, and it's not very often asked of our political officials.
But we were talking about the conflict between Israel and its neighbors and how it's been there forever. But this time, the conflict has erupted again, and it was because of Hezbollah, and they kidnapped those two Israeli soldiers. So what do you think about who provoked the conflict this time?
Well, actually, that's not why this conflict erupted. This conflict erupted because the Israelis were preparing for this conflict with the United States for many years. Then the Israelis provoked the Palestinians and the Lebanese, realized the time at which the Hezbollah took two Israeli soldiers. And what they said their reason was, first, at the very time this happened, the Israelis were pulverizing the Palestinians in Gaza. Now, what is Gaza? It's essentially an open-air prison. More than 1 million Palestinians are imprisoned by the Israelis behind fences and walls and watchtowers. The Israeli army at every checkpoint, entry into or from Gaza, is controlled by Israel, not by Palestinians. At that point, the Hezbollah said, one, we're going to come to the help of our Palestinian brethren. That's the heart of the conflict, Palestine. And two, that the Israelis have held many Lebanese in their prisons and hold 10,000 Palestinians, including many women and children, and we are going to trade. We are also going to have a few hostages because we can't tolerate that 10,000 are being held by Israel. The origins of this conflict are presented by the Israelis as, we were totally unprovoked, we withdrew from Lebanon. Of course, they occupied it for 18 years, and the history of what they did during that occupation is not a very pretty history. So let's not get drawn in to the government public relations of what's going on, and let's talk today about what's really going on.
But even in light of the situation that Israel is facing right now, let's talk about that time when they were actually in Lebanon, and it was so hard for them during that time. So I could think for the Israeli government and the Israeli people, they know that going back into Lebanon is going to give them a lot of problems and a lot of trouble again. And you were talking about their conflict with the Palestinians just now. At this time, is it really necessary for them to fight on two fronts?
Actually, I believe they're planning to fight on more than two fronts. I don't really believe this is about Gaza, which has no real weapons that can harm the Israelis, nor is it about Hezbollah. This is about Iran. Iran is emerging as the superpower of the region. The Iranians are, of course, arming Hezbollah. They are trying to help the Palestinians. But the biggest arms flow into the region by far is the American arms flow to the Israelis. And the Israelis have the big bombers, the big guns, the big tanks, the technology. The other side has relatively few weapons. Look at the number of deaths. So let's immediately realize this is not about what we see on the screens today. It's really about what's going to happen in the region, what's going to be done vis-a-vis Iran. My own belief, and I could give you a lot of supporting evidence, is that Israel and the U.S. are trying very hard to provoke Syria and Iran and to find some public relations excuse that will allow them to do to Syria and Iran what they've now done to Lebanon. I know that sounds shocking. I know that sounds horrible. I wish I didn't have to say it. But just last night, the Israelis sent troops to Baalbek, close to the Syrian border, and the provocation game is happening as we speak. As we speak right now.
But what we are looking at right now, well, yeah, I think a lot of people think differently from you about this issue. Like looking at Iran, a lot of our European allies are almost in agreement with Iran. And after the Lebanese conflict started again, the United States and Europe they're at odds again, and it might be harder to solve the Iranian problem. And then you're talking about the Israeli issue. We know that Hezbollah is they were using the southern part of Lebanon to attack Israel. So shouldn't Israel try to get rid of the armed threat that they were facing in southern Lebanon?
Well, if you look at it as if, gee, Israel's at peace, and there are these people who are fighting the Israelis, that's one perspective. That's not the perspective of anybody in the Middle East. This war has been going on since the 40s. There's no peace treaty between Lebanon and Israel. The reason there's no peace treaty is because there's no settlement of the Palestinian issue. The Palestinians have been occupied now for 30-some years, a very brutal occupation. I would use the term apartheid. And I would say, in fact, that what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians is considerably worse than the apartheid of South Africa, when the whole world rose up in opposition to what the white South Africans were doing. So it's time to put this in perspective, and I agree with you. A lot of people in Washington won't talk about it in these terms because it doesn't get them invited to talk shows, and maybe I won't be invited back as well. But I'm here to tell you what all those trips to the Middle East, all those meetings I had, all those things I learned, all those things I've written about, I'm learning to tell you what I believe is the situation, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
We welcome different points of view, and it's a very complicated issue that we're just talking about here. But you were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a lot of Muslims and Arabs are very supportive of the Palestinians and against Israel. But when we look at the Lebanese and Lebanon, the relationship between Lebanon and Israel is a little bit different. We know, but before the conflict broke out, the Syrian army had just left Lebanon, and the Western countries were sort of trying to prop up, trying to support that Lebanese government and hope that they can become democratic and peaceful. And Hezbollah, they went and kidnapped those Israeli soldiers. they weren't supported or approved to do that by the Lebanese government. What I'm trying to say here is that there are a lot of people who support Hezbollah in Lebanon, but there are a lot of people also who don't, and they didn't want them to provoke this conflict. They didn't want to get into this war. So what do you think of that? Some people are critical, saying that Hezbollah, they hijacked the whole of Lebanon.
You see, I don't see this in terms of supporting Hezbollah, although I've met many people in the Middle East. I've never actually met anybody in Hezbollah. I see this as a Middle East war in which Israel is attempting, with the United States, to enforce a new world order on the people of the region. If you really want to take it back, and we won't go too much into history today, it goes back 100 years to the Paris Peace Conference of 1918, when the boundaries of the region were established, when French and British troops were marching around the region, installing regimes here. They put the Hashemite regime in Jordan. They put the Saud regime in Saudi Arabia. They carved Lebanon away from Syria. They carved Palestine away also from Syria. So there's deep, deep roots here, and I'm sure people in China know their history, and they understand the nuances and the differences between what happened in this region, what happened at this time, what happened with Japan, and I know that the Chinese people don't understand very well the Middle East. There's very few Jews who are living with you, so for people in China, this is extra complicated because they don't grow up learning the history of the region. But we in the U.S. do learn it, and I was fortunate to go to very good schools, and then I was fortunate to travel over there. And a lot of the things I learned before I started going to the Middle East, I kind of had to unlearn.
Of course, talking about history, talking about realities, these issues are very complicated to members of audience. You're tuning into VOA's Issues and Opinions today. We're talking about the situation in Lebanon. And we have the honor of having an expert who is the founder and publisher of Mideast Realities. His name is Mark Bruzonsky, who speaks English. And again, we have an expert, the Mideast expert in our studio to exchange views with our audience. Our toll-free number is 10810-866-837-5161. Again, it's 10810-866-837-5161. Please do call in to participate in our discussion so that we can talk about the situation in Lebanon. Let's go to Jiangxi. Mr. Li, hello. 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 I think that when there are conflicts, there are deaths. When there are deaths, there will be hatred. Then there is hatred, there is terror, and there is terror, there is suffering. And with all that, there will be no happy life, without which this world will be horrified. Okay, Mr. Lee, what do you think of the conflict in Lebanon? Well, let me finish. Well, my question is, when will the mankind free itself of all these sufferings? I think that the conflict in Lebanon shouldn't be there. Of course, there are many reasons to it. The United States is behind this. Israel, of course, is serving as the cannon fodder, and it doesn't even know what it is doing. And I hope that the sufferings of the world will end. Thank you, Mr. Li of Jiangxi. Let's take another call from Jiangxi also. Mr. Xiao, hello. Hello to you both. Well, before I pose my question, I would like to share with you what I think. Go ahead. I think that the root cause for the war in Lebanon is because Lebanon abducted 2 Israeli soldiers, and this in itself is a very stupid act, and it's an act of terror. And that, of course, caused the military action. First, when Israel launched military actions to strike the Hezbollah, I thought that was justifiable. However, as the war proceeded, there have been a lot of casualties on the part of the civilians. And in the process, the Israelis lost the sympathy of the world, who really sympathized with the Israelis, and now the international community has come to realize the cruelties of the war, and the international community is working to form peacekeepers. Mr. Xiao, we know your views. So what's your question? Yeah, here's my question. First, well, let me think of my question. Well, my question is, if the military action fails to achieve its goals, what will the international community as well as the Arabs think of the Israelis? Thank you, Mr. Xiao. Well, the first caller, Mr. Lee, said that the United States was behind Israel. I'm sure his view is very similar to yours. Mr. Xiao says, however, that it was Hezbollah who started this whole thing. So there are 2 points. First, what is your view of the role that is played by Hezbollah, and secondly, what will the consequences be?
Let me put it this way. The Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982. The stated goal at the time was to destroy the PLO and to make Lebanon safe from terrorism against Israel. Maybe many of your viewers and listeners in China are young. Maybe they don't remember this. There was no Hezbollah in 1982. Hezbollah was created in 1983. And why was it created? It was created specifically because the Israelis, with American support, had invaded their country, were occupying their country, and American troops had then been sent. American Marines were then sent on behalf of the Israelis. Of course, it was presented as a peace mission, blah, 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 but the reality was it was to support Israel's geopolitical and strategic goals. That's when Hezbollah was created. So now, of course, the invasion is taking place 20-some years later. Again, the goal isn't to destroy Hezbollah. The goal is to remake the political map of the Middle East. That's what real wars are about.
Now, at that time when Israel entered Lebanon, there was PLO that was controlling political life in Lebanon, and they were striking Israel. And as you said, Israel came back, withdrew from Lebanon, and of
brutal occupation. Remember when your country, remember when China was occupied by the Japanese? You're still talking about it these days. You remember what happened.
However, if Israel has withdrawn, why can't Hezbollah stop their military, their attacks? Of course, they are talking about Palestinians, but as far as Lebanon is concerned, there should be no issue of resistance.
Let's not fall into the trap of saying, oh, there's Lebanon, and there's Jordan, and there's Egypt, and they don't have anything to do with each other, and they're all very separate. So, gee, we Israelis are such nice guys. We withdrew to the international border, except for this little place that we don't know quite, Sheba Farms. Let's not talk about what happened during the occupation. Oh, and it's not connected to the Palestinian issue. Of course it's connected to the Palestinian issue. The whole world except the Israelis know that it's connected to the Palestinian issues. And if we didn't have such an outrageous government, if I may say, I'm an independent person. I know I'm here at VOA, but if you'll allow me, I live in a city. We have a rogue government. Our rogue government, our rogue superpower likes to talk about the rogue countries in the world. Well, many of us who have drinks at the end of the day, we talk about our rogue government. We're very afraid of what our government is doing. We're very afraid of the lies, the distortions, and the repression that's growing in our own country. All of these things are tied together. But as far as the Israeli situation, the heart of it is the Palestinian issue. So thank you, Mr. President Bush. You've been repeating ad nauseum that we should go to the root of the conflict and solve it. The root of the conflict didn't start this summer. The root of the conflict started a long time ago. Let's end this occupation of the Palestinian people, and let's have the support of Russia and China in the Security Council. Let's not allow the rogue superpower to push itself around, to push all of us around and create worse conflicts for the future, which is what I fear is happening right now.
Yeah, but no matter what, right now the United States government is in the process of diplomatic efforts and trying to solve this issue, and they need the United States to play a role to solve this problem.
No. The United States is involved in diplomatic smokescreens. You call them efforts. I'll call them diplomatic smokescreens. The United States is buying time for Israel. The United States is blowing political smoke all over the place, sending the Israelis more weapons, getting them more time to do militarily what they want to do. And in my view, shared by many people in this country who don't normally get onto national TV programs, the Israelis and the Americans are trying to provoke a wider conflict. They want the excuse to take down the military capabilities of Iran, and we may see this happening within the next month or two, or world opinion may be such and geopolitical affairs may be such that they won't be able to. But in my view, that is their goal. The goal is Iran and Syria.
So you think that soon Iran and or Syria might have an armed conflict with Israel or the United States?
No, I think soon Israel and the United States may have an armed conflict with Iran. And I would urge people in China who are really, really interested in this. Now it's an internet world. We can all read whatever we think is of use. We have a publication called Rolling Stone in this country. It's not a rock band publication. It's actually a pretty serious publication. The current issue has a major article by James Bamford, one of our best investigative journalists, precisely upon how the neocons in Washington have for years. Now, the neocons are a group of, many of them are Jewish. They're right-wing Zionist. They've been opposed to the peace process, opposed to a Palestinian state. They have great influence on the American government. This particular article, and to make it easy, we'll make the article available from MiddleEast.org. That's the organization I publish. Mideast Realities is at MiddleEast.org. And by midnight tonight in China, we'll have a link to the article I just mentioned and anything else that comes up.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we should take a few calls from our Chinese callers, see what they have to say. This is Issues and Opinions on the Voice of America. Our free phone number is at 1-866-837-5161. That's toll free. Right now we're talking about the Lebanese crisis. And here in the studio with us we have Mark Bruzonsky, founder and publisher of Mideast Realities. He's a real true expert on Middle East issues, and we're working through interpreters today to talk to the callers. Let's go to Mr. Gao from Jiangsu. Hi, Mr. Gao. Hello, Wang Nan. Hello, Mr. Bruzonsky. I don't agree with Mr. Bruzonsky. He thinks if it weren't for the United States provoking and helping Israel, then we wouldn't have what we have. But I think Israel is a democratic state, and they're surrounded by all of those Arabic countries, and some of them are neo-Nazi tending countries. But these Arabic countries, if there's any democracy at all, it's a very, very, very narrow definition of democracy. They don't have real democracy like Israel has. So, Israel needs the United States. If it weren't for the United States, Israel probably would not exist. Thank you, Mr. Gao from Jiangsu. Let me sort of try to reorganize what he was saying here. I think what he was saying is that in the Middle East, the Arab countries don't want to let Israel exist, but Israel has the support of the United States, so it exists. And then he was saying that only with the United States can we have the world order that we have. Otherwise, bad countries would be occupying good countries in the world today. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I don't see much of a world order. I see a great deal of world disorder, and I expect it to get considerably worse precisely because of the policies that are being pursued. You know, it's a nice simplistic discussion. Somebody's a democracy and somebody's not a democracy, and we call them names and we throw out Nazi terms. That suggests that the person's never been to the Middle East, doesn't really know much about the Middle East, and so uses these simplistic terms to discuss it. The heart of the problem, let's get back to it, is the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. Rightly or wrongly, depending, you know, the street has a different view, the governments have a different view, the Arab world said at their Arab summit in 2002, and believe me, if we were talking about Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Egypt and you wanted a critique of what's happening in those countries, oh boy, could we critique what's happening in those countries. But right now we're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Israelis have refused, not only refused to allow a Palestinian state, they have made a Palestinian state impossible. They have built illegal settlements throughout the regions. They have taken the land resources, the water resources. They have put the Palestinians on Bantustans around every city, our Israeli military tanks and checkpoints. Lots of Palestinians are in Israeli prisons. Many of them are teenagers and women. There are no charges against these people. So if we're going to be concerned for a few soldiers who are prisoners of war, I wonder why the caller isn't concerned about 10,000 people out of a population of 3 million who are in Israeli prisons, and about an entire society which is held in bondage, in captivity. I use the word apartheid. So I think there are probably a lot of people in China who need to do a lot more understanding of what this conflict's really all about.
So talking about Palestine, I think Israel and the United States governments are not against in the future establishing a state of Palestine that can coexist with Israel. That's Israel's policy. It's out in the open, isn't it?
That's completely incorrect. And if that's what is said here on VOA, I'm afraid you have to distinguish between what governments say and what governments do. It's the same with people in many cases. I would look much more closely at what the governments do rather than what they say. The Israelis have prevented a Palestinian state from coming into being. They've now made it pretty much impossible for a real independent Palestinian state to come into being. The Americans are totally guilty as well, because it's sort of the good cop, bad cop relationship when it comes to Israel and the U.S. So don't believe for a minute the kinds of things you see Shimon Peres saying on Lair NewsHour last night. That is frankly a bunch of crap. I've known Shimon Peres from '79. He's better than ever at dispensing the crap, but that's exactly what it is. PR nonsense.
I think I would just like to defend the VOA here. We have to have all kinds of reports from all different angles and all different commentary angles. So I think whatever we hear, we will report. So I believe that we don't have any very wrong reports, but...
I don't know, but let's be very candid. It's not likely I'll be back on your program. I hope your viewers in China will go to MiddleEast.org. And the reason I won't be back on your program is precisely because I'm speaking up honestly and independently and forthrightly, calling our government a rogue superpower, which is what we all joke about it at night over beers. That's what we'll all be talking about at 5 o'clock. You're a government agency, and that constrains greatly. We're a very sophisticated superpower in this country. In China, things are much more brutal. This is censored, this is censored, this is censored. Here it's much more sophisticated. You're just not invited back. You just can't come to our think tank meeting. You just aren't going to be a guest on the Lair NewsHour. Shimon Peres is going to be. I mean, let's be honest with the people in China whose country has now become a major player in the world economically. And soon China will become a major player politically, not just in its own region, but on the world stage. So let's use the few minutes we have, which will probably be my last, here at VOA anyway, to say it as it really is.
Okay, since you're putting it that way, I'm going to have to invite you back, definitely.
I'll come if you invite me back, but
Thank you. Okay, there's a lot of people waiting on the line, and let's first take a few calls from our Chinese callers and see what they have to say.
You're tuning into VOA's Issues and Opinions. 866-837-516. Mr. Wang of Shanghai. Hello. Go ahead. Well, right now on TV screen, we know that Israel has been attacked by terrorists many times, and the Lebanese abducted 2 Israeli soldiers. They are really trying to create something, to stir up something. Of course, Israel was right to strike back. Thank you, Mr. Wang, for bringing up the right to defend itself for Israel. Mr. Pu of Jiangsu, hello, go ahead. Hello to you both. I agree with Mr. Bruzonsky's views. Whoever is at fault, it doesn't really matter. You really cannot just kill the civilians at will. On this, I think the United States is not doing what it should be doing. It should be the model for democracy and human rights. But that image has collapsed. Thank you, Mr. Pu of Jiangsu. Both callers have very opposing views. One agrees with Mr. Bruzonsky and the other is against his views. Let's see what Mr. Zhang of Hebei thinks. Hello, Mr. Zhang. Hello. I really appreciate the frankness and openness of the guest, and he calls the United States a rogue power, and in China, nobody dares to say that of their own government. They would be accused of trying to subvert the government. On the Arab-Israel conflict, I think there are historical reasons, there are religious reasons. However, I think whether we're talking about Arabs or the Israelis, they should really learn from the Westerners, and that is to live and let live. Otherwise, it's going to be a vicious cycle. In China, we're trying to build a harmonious society. In the world, in order to build a harmonious society, all countries and all people should live in peace, regardless of religion and others. Thank you, Mr. Zhang of Hebei. The 3 callers have expressed their views. Now I'm going to turn this over to our guest, Mr. Bruzonsky.
You know, a number of the callers have rightly talked about the world itself and world peace. All of us are citizens on this planet, whether we're Chinese or Americans or Jewish or Arab. By squandering our resources on military affairs, by preparing to do battle with each other, and you've got issues in China too. Your military is building, and it has reasons for building. We are not putting our resources into ending global warming, into disease, into hunger, into harmonious international accord. That is really the biggest issue of all. Unfortunately, the leadership of the United States is now considerably in doubt. Our own society has great problems, is great weakening of our own internal political and social and economic infrastructure. Now to get back to the Middle East. Let's solve the Palestinian problem. No more kowtowing to these officials who get on TV and tell us, oh, we're so sorry that we had to kill the children. Every life means so much to us. And then, of course, the bombs drop on the next UN base. This war came about because the U.S. and Israel wanted this war. If time permitted, which it doesn't, we could go into all the provocations over a long period of time, including the fact that Hamas had a ceasefire for 1.5 years, which it maintained until the Israelis started assassinating Hamas government officials and strangulating Palestinian society. So I'm not surprised that some of your viewers have the views they have, because we're all, in a sense, the victim of the information that comes to us. That's why it's important that there be VOA, that there be BBC, that there be competing entities. But nevertheless, we also have to be candid. VOA is not an independent broadcaster. It's totally this is not unimportant. Now, I know in China, everybody's used to this. Government controls all the media. We in America are not so used to this. We were used to a much more open, much more vibrant. Everybody says they want all the views that are out there, but that's not what goes on in Washington. The range of views that's allowed on American national television is extremely small. And if you wanted to have real views on your program, I could introduce you to some Syrian interns who are in town for the summer, to some Palestinians who know intimately what's going on in Palestine. I've never seen these people on American corporate TV. And I'm not just talking about VOA, I'm talking about PBS. Last night, PBS on the Lair News Hour. Did they have an independent analyst? Not at all. They had Shimon Peres with nobody to seriously interrogate him or actually point out what a propaganda session he was engaged in.
However, the U.S. media, in the U.S. media, we've seen spokesmen for Palestinian authorities speak. We hear the Lebanese refugees. Of course, our funding is from the U.S. government. However, we do have independence in our editorial matters. We have we have experts from think tanks. We have congressmen on both parties. We also have people from all walks of life holding different views regarding the U.S. government in our studio to talk about everything, as well as the conflict in Lebanon.
That's not my experience in Washington. Everybody says they have a wide range of views. As I've said before, the range of views, I'm not familiar with who your guests at VOA have been. If you give me a list, we could talk about it. I am familiar with PBS, NBC, CBS, Fox News, most of which I've been on at some point. The range of views is about this broad. The range of views in the world is like this. In Europe and the Middle East, what passes for discussion here is far more sophisticated than anything that the American people are allowed to see.
Good. Well, let's use our valuable time to take some calls. Mr. Lin of Fujian, sorry, please be terse. Go ahead. Hello to you both. Hello. Well, if Israel wants to destroy the Hezbollah guerrillas, well, the question I have for the guests is whether the Hezbollah is a dictatorship like the Communist Party in China. If they are a dictatorship, then I would like to say on behalf of all the people who desire democracy to have it wiped out, as we want to do the communist parties. If they are a democratic force, then democracies all over the world should oppose Israel. Well, of course, the situation in Middle East is very, very complex. Hezbollah is represented in the government as well. However, Israel wants to demilitarize, to take the weapons away from the Hezbollah. Well, here we take a call from another Mr. Lin from Guangdong. Hello, go ahead. Hello to you both. Hello, go ahead. I have this question to ask. The UN peacekeepers will be sent to Lebanon, but what will be doing? What will they be doing? Well, okay, we understand your question. Let's take a call from Shanghai. Mr. Liu of Shanghai, hello. The situation in Lebanon, between Lebanon and Israel, will not be resolved. Even with the UN peacekeepers, the issues will not be resolved. Because the hatred goes so deep and goes so far back. Of course, I don't totally agree with the guest. He describes the United States as a rogue power. Well, I'm sorry to cut you short. We don't have much more time. We'll have only time for Mr. Zhang, who is viewing us on the website. Mr. Zhang, please be terse. Go ahead. Hello. Of course, the Palestinians and the Lebanon civilians are suffering. Through their suffering, I understand that the weak does not have diplomacy. If Lebanon is as powerful as Israel, it's not likely to suffer the way it is suffering. And I'm really happy for the guest. I think the mainstream media in the United States invites you to the studio to talk about this. I think this is a very good thing. Of course, the U.S. media is under the sway of the Jews. Well, I understand your view. I have to cut you short. Okay, thank you. I have to cut you short. I'm going to give 1 minute to Mr. Bruzonsky to respond to all these issues.
The question about UN peacekeepers is very, very important. I'll try to be very succinct. What the United States is attempting to do first is buy the Israelis more time. And when I say the Israelis, I mean the U.S. and Israel. This is not a war being fought just by Israel. It's being fought by the U.S. and Israel. So political smoke's being thrown all over the place by Condi Rice, and all kinds of delays are being thrown into the process. Then the U.S. will attempt to push through a UN resolution that will establish not a UN force, but a multinational force that we will be able to control. Command and control will be our thing, not actual troops. Whether that will be go through the UN is up in the air now. They're not talking about a blue helmet force. They're talking about a UN military force, much more like what happened in Korea than what has happened before in the Middle East. We've had peacekeeping forces in the past. What this administration, my rogue government, to repeat the phrase, is attempting to do is put a military UN force. Remember what happened in Korea.
I'm interrupting you here, but it's not because I don't agree with what you're saying. It's because the time is up. That is it for our studio discussion here. We'd like to thank very much Mr. Mark Bruzonsky, founder and publisher of Mideast Realities. And we'd also like to thank the callers, the viewers, the listeners, and the web viewers that called in. And we'll continue to watch what's going on in Lebanon and to report from all different sides and angles. And we'd like to say that those views expressed of everyone here today does not represent the views of the Voice of America. Let's now go to EFN for more news of the day. Thank you, Wang Nan. This is Issues and Opinions on the Voice of America. And South Korea's Foreign Minister Pan Ki-moon said that he will hold talks with his Japanese counterpart next week to discuss ways of resolving the North Korea's nuclear weapons crisis. Pan Ki-moon, South Korea's foreign minister, said that he will
我们刚才现场讨论了以色列跟黎巴嫩真主党武装的激烈冲突，双方的激战使得黎巴嫩部分地区遭到广泛的破坏，同时也勾起了人们对黎巴嫩内战的痛苦记忆。黎巴嫩曾经是中东经济繁荣的一颗明珠，可是也多次被卷入地区之争。请收听收看美国之音的电视报道。
贝鲁特过去的好时光。约瑟夫·西西皮奥热爱贝鲁特这座城市，也热爱黎巴嫩。他曾经担任美利坚大学贝鲁特分校的校长，后来遭到绑架，并且做了5年的人质。 真主党游击队7月12号俘获2名以色列士兵，从而引发当前危机的时候，西西皮奥正在黎巴嫩首都。他说，这座曾经居住着快乐居民、前途光明的城市，在以色列攻击中完全变样。他说，
酒店空了，街道上见不到汽车，商店关门了，饭店也关门了。你看四处走走，但是碰不到一个人影，好像就在一夜之间，一切都死掉了。这种感觉非常可怕。
历史上，黎巴嫩曾几度繁荣，但是也饱受战火的蹂躏。贝鲁特以宽阔的街道和法国式建筑而著称，一直被誉为中东的巴黎。1975年爆发内战之前，黎巴嫩被称为中东的瑞士，像中美洲的哥斯达黎加一样，享受着没有冲突的美好时光。但是矛盾的种子却已经播下。1948年爆发阿以冲突以后，数十万巴勒斯坦难民涌进黎巴嫩。阿拉法特领导的巴勒斯坦解放组织主管他们的政治和军事行动。巴勒斯坦解放组织在1970年代参与了黎巴嫩的内战。这场战争还涉及到叙利亚。以色列为了要阻止针对以色列平民的边境袭击，在1978年和1982年2度入侵黎巴嫩。居住在黎巴嫩的政治分析人士萨勒姆指出，虽然当前的战局看起来似曾相识，但是这个地区的情况已经发生了许多变化。他说，
我们处在后911事件的漩涡之中，美国插手了伊拉克，美国和叙利亚散伙了，当然美国和伊朗也闹翻了，和平进程成了僵尸。
以色列2000年从宣称的南部黎巴嫩安全区域撤军，叙利亚在去年在牵扯到谋杀黎巴嫩前总理哈里里事件之后也撤军了。在发生目前的危机之前，黎巴嫩的经济正在迅速发展，主要得益于良好的银行系统以及中小型生产规模和国际的援助。阿拉伯美国人研究学会的主任佐格比说，各方都应该了解，战争解决不了中东的任何问题。他说，
解决的办法是每个人，包括阿拉伯一方、以色列一方和美国一方，都认识到军事胜利是不存在的，基本上是政治问题的事情，不能用军事手段来解决。
最近这几十年里，黎巴嫩经历过一些政治稳定和经济繁荣的年代，期间伴随着巨大的动荡时期。在以色列和真主党之间停止当前的战事之后，黎巴嫩人民又将面临重建家园的艰巨而长期的任务，同时期待未来将变得更加太平。美国之音电视报道。
好，这次的美国之音时事大家谈就播送到这里，谢谢您的收听、收看和参与，我是王楠，
我是叶凡，我们明天再会，
再见。